Every Lent, the church gives us three practices to focus on: almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. And I know if you're like me, I always get focused as I prepare for Lent on what am I going to give up? What's going to be my fasting? What's my sacrifice? And of course, we all know during the Lenten season that we're called to pray more, to draw closer in union with God. But I think out of all three, the one that I tend to neglect the most, and I focus on the least amount, and I think other people do too, is almsgiving. Where does almsgiving fit into our Lenten practices? We know that almsgiving and charity to the poor is a good thing. And besides social justice, is it a spiritual thing? Is it part of our spiritual disciplines that grows us closer to God? That's the question we want to tackle this evening: the spiritual role of almsgiving. I'm very excited about this topic, especially during our Lenten journey, the topic of almsgiving. I think there's a deep spiritual meaning to almsgiving, one that a lot of us, maybe you're a cradle Catholic like myself, we just grew up and we knew that there was almsgiving, and I knew that we had a little box with the rice bowl to give to charity. We always had that in our family. And as kids, we would put our quarters and dimes and our allowance money, we would tithe to contribute to that. And that was a good thing, but I had no idea the meaning of almsgiving as a spiritual practice. And I think a lot of people wonder what that is. And there's a terrific book that I just really love on this, and I give out to a lot of friends and a lot of our donors here at the Augustine Institute. It's by Gary Anderson. It's called Charity, The Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition. And I really recommend this book for your spiritual reading during Lent or even after Lent. It's a fabulous, opens up this whole realm of almsgiving in light of Scripture. And I'm just so excited about this book that I've asked the author, Dr. Gary Anderson, to join us tonight and help open up the meaning of almsgiving for us. Dr. Anderson did his PhD in Biblical Studies at Harvard University. He is a professor of Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures at Notre Dame University and author of many wonderful scholarly books. And it's just really a great pleasure, Gary, to have you join us. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, Gary, I think a lot of people know about almsgiving as a practice and maybe as a social justice practice, but I don't think many people think about it as a spiritual practice. What do you think about that?
I think that's very true. I think for me, when I began researching this book, it was actually in some senses a spiritual challenge for me to write. I mean, in part because the material was so beautiful, and I often felt as a scholar or a writer, I couldn't do justice to what these texts were trying to say. But I think also it really, in a sense, touched me deeply in the sense that I saw how central it was to how the Christian church, certainly from its origin, saw and understood itself. And its centrality was really quite extraordinary to me. Not just the church, I should add, but synagogue as well. The church is really dependent, we might want to say, on the legacy that the synagogue handed on to us. But its importance, I guess, if I was to maybe just summarize it, I would think of a very famous story. Benedict XVI mentions it in his encyclical on charity, where this famous Roman emperor, Julian the Apostate, who was raised Christian but apostatizes, and as a consequence of his, you might want to say, turning away from Christianity, he tries to reinvigorate pagan religion. But the one thing he knows that really is a point of attraction to the church is the way in which it shares its goods measurably, demonstrably to the poor. And so he does everything within his power to bring, we might want to say, those moral capabilities to bear on Greco-Roman religion. He fails in large part because, I mean, he's very well intentioned in wanting to do this, but it just doesn't fit into, we might want to say, the DNA of Greco-Roman religion. Christianity emerging, of course, from Judaism, the Hebrew Bible, it lives and breathes this virtue. And that was really the face of the church in the ancient world, and really the face of the church almost until the early modern period. I think I have nothing against, mind you, the involvement of the state in distributing goods to the poor. But once that begins in the 17th and the 18th century, and the church begins to concede that ground to the state, that's a real watershed moment in the evolution of Christian piety. And I don't think most modern people realize that, just how things change in the 17 and 1800s. This had always been the 100% full responsibility of the church, and lay people were organized in confraternities to deliver goods of every kind to the poor. And now it's more of a side, activity within the church. Maybe necessarily so because of the way in which modern cultures are constructed. But I think it has, really affected the way in which the Christian practice of almsgiving looks.
One of the things I appreciate so much, Gary, what you show is the biblical roots and how central it is to Judaism for almsgiving, and then the New Testament. And you have this biblical foundation for almsgiving being really vital for living either a Jewish or a Christian life. And I think that you can see how the early church fathers and then the tradition really built upon that. And the idea of almsgiving and living a Christian life were really inseparable. They were really closely identified. And I'm looking forward to talking and hearing from you about the biblical roots of that. But before I do that, I just want to let our audience know we love your questions during the show. So if you have questions on almsgiving and the biblical roots for that, and whether the Old Testament, New Testament, please feel free to text us your questions. And you can do that on our text line, 720-650-0100. So just text your questions and just let us know your name and where you're from and what your question is. We want to be able to read that and share that with the audience when you have your question. Also, you can leave your questions and comments on the forum platform under the comments section for the show. So either way, you can get your questions to us, and our crew will send those questions up to me, and I'll be able to share those questions with Gary. And you've got a great biblical scholar here, so I want you to take advantage for our audience to ask these questions. Well, Gary, let's talk about before we get into the biblical roots of it, you mentioned in your book a story about Gerard Manley Hopkins with a friend of his, and it brings out how almsgiving can bring about conversion. And I love that theme for Lent, because I think that's one of the spiritual aspects of almsgiving, is how it can change the heart. You want to share that story?
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. He had a long correspondence with a man named Mr. Bridges, who evidently had grown out of his own Christian faith. And Hopkins, at one point, in attempting to encourage him back to the faith, makes the point he's not going to begin with the doctrine of the Trinity or the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist or so on and so forth, but he asks him to give alms, not necessarily just money, but giving his time as well, perhaps visiting the sick or what have you. But the point that he emphasizes is that he needs to give enough, either of his time or his money, that his regular habits of living are inconvenienced. And in the exchange, Bridges writes back a little bit puzzled. He says, this is kind of like, what is like putting on a hair shirt? Is it just, making me uncomfortable for no good reason? But I think that Hopkins' answer is really quite extraordinary. And I think it gets to the heart of why almsgiving is so central to Christian piety, because he says in essence, and I'm in a sense paraphrasing here, but it's impossible to understand, the love God has for the world, the suffering that God underwent on the cross, for example, to redeem the world, if you have no experience yourself of what it might mean to suffer out of charity for another. So for Hopkins, the important thing wasn't the inconvenience, let's say the unhappiness that would follow for not having enough money to buy that latte at Starbucks, but rather it was the coordination, we might want to say, of these, ordinary acts of suffering, but oriented toward love for a fellow citizen of planet Earth. And for Hopkins, Christianity isn't just what you think or believe. You actually have to enact it. And when you begin to enact it that way, then what the church teaches at the more theoretical level about the character of God's love for the world becomes a much more plausible, we might want to say, belief
I love that.
instead of behaviors.
Yeah, I love that example of Hopkins that you give, because the idea of experiencing the cost of giving and being charitable, it gives you an experience of God's charity and God's love, which is gratuitous. God doesn't have to love us. And that experience leading people on the road to conversion and to faith. And of course, it makes sense that Gerard Manley Hopkins would do that as a Jesuit, because Ignatius was doing that, inviting people, young men, to go to the hospitals and give. And by practicing charity, they would experience and then have a deeper conviction of God's charity. Well, let's talk about the biblical roots of almsgiving. Gary, I think a lot of us Catholics, I know as a cradle Catholic, I didn't know Scripture really well. Of course, I ended up studying it later on. But I think a lot of everyday Catholics don't know the biblical roots of almsgiving. And where would you have them start? What books of the Bible would you want to recommend that we go to start learning about almsgiving?
Well, I think, if we want to certainly understand what, Jesus is going to teach in the Gospels, and actually what the fathers are going to teach as well, we'd want to begin probably, counterintuitively to most of our listeners, with the book of Proverbs and Ben Sira.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that struck me most in this project is, the prophets are important, and many people think of the prophets as the kind of singular voice here with respect to social justice for the poor, and that's not untrue. But the fathers of the church, and certainly Jesus in the Gospels, in terms of the imagery that he utilizes, is more drawn from books like Proverbs and Ben Sira, because these books are trying to describe, as I would put it, the kind of character of the world that God has created. So that, I'm all for social justice, but the problem with leaving charity simply within that framework is all you're talking about is readjusting people's, access to monetary goods, which is a good in itself. I don't want to downplay that. But what really struck at the heart of early Christian preaching was not just that, but the way in which almsgiving as an act of sacrificial giving transformed the person, who engaged in it. And that's why it was so important, as a evangelical, mission, both to preach it for others to do, but people joining the church to enact it, to become, familiar with that dimension of the Christian faith. So I'd be happy to elaborate on either of those. Ben Sira goes kind of in one direction, Tobit in another.
Yeah, those are great texts, and I love what you say, because I think a lot of people think that, we need to address social justice, and people of all faiths have a deeper or lesser conviction about that. But if you look at people like Mother Teresa of Calcutta and her beautiful sisters and the Sisters of Charity, their lives are dedicated to loving and giving. And there's a deeper, what motivates someone like Mother Teresa of Calcutta to be a sister of charity, right? I think, and that's where you look at these texts like Tobit or Proverbs. Well, one of the things that both Ben Sira and Tobit that you refer to, they use this analogy of a heavenly treasury. Why don't you explain that analogy of what it means to have a heavenly treasury that you're storing up?
So great, that's really central to the whole issue, and becomes extraordinarily important in the Catholic Church, and essentially will become part and parcel of what is going to be known in the medieval period as the treasury of merits. So it becomes something of a contested site, we might want to say, in the Reformation as well. And might be worth mentioning just for your readers that this is a problem with the study of charity actually to the present day, is that, and I didn't realize this when I jumped into it, but that you're bumping up against some major points of division that emerge in the 16th century, but maybe we can hold that for later. The treasury of heaven is an idea that I suggest in my book, begins with Ben Sira and Tobit, but it's based on a very early piece of biblical exegesis of a couple of verses in Proverbs. There's a curious verse it occurs actually two times slightly differently in Proverbs 10 and 11 that states that individuals who hoard, I'm going to paraphrase here how Tobit would have read it, that individuals who hoard their money in the end aren't going to benefit. The only thing that will really preserve you from unanticipated calamity in the future is giving money away. I mean, that is the star verse. And for me, that verse is so incredibly Christological, right? The way in which Christ attains his kingdom is dying on a cross. What could be, more counterintuitive than that? And so the way this verse from Proverbs was read by Second Temple Jewish thinkers like the author of the Book of Tobit or Ben Sira was that, this kind of cruciform pattern that we see in the Gospels is exactly the kind of pattern that governs the way we should act with respect to our wallet. In other words, most of us think that if we're going to provide for ourselves in our old age, the way to do that is to simply hoard as much as you can. And I'm not going to argue against saving for retirement. That's not my point here. But the counterintuitive biblical teaching is that, that's not necessarily going to be the best strategy. The best strategy for you in terms of preserving yourself into your old age and, of course, after death and final judgment is going to be the charity that you display for your neighbors. So clearly Matthew 25, when you were hungry, when were you hungry, when were you thirsty, all of that comes right out of this. But it's not that new. Matthew 25 is essentially the theology of Proverbs 10 as read through the book of Tobit, but just putting Christ in there instead of God. I mean, that's an important change, but it's not actually that big. That idea of Matthew 25 is already there in Tobit and Tobit's reading of Proverbs.
I love the idea of, we definitely have to save up for retirement, but we also have to save up for our eternal retirement, right? And there's a benefit to that, and that almsgiving gives. Well, I
think if I could just maybe go back, I'm sorry to interrupt, but maybe go back to your example of Mother Teresa. I think one of the things that makes her so outstanding here and so extraordinary and why we revere her is that she had the spiritual gift to actually not engage in that kind of, we might want to say quantitative reasoning about our future. She gave up everything. And even for her order, it was when people are holy, I never realized this until I went to an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum about, St. Francis of Assisi. I mean, the money that flowed into Assisi after his death was extraordinary. The churches that were built, everyone wanted to get a piece of, the extraordinary holiness of St. Francis. And the same thing was true of Mother Teresa. People wanted to endow her order. They were all in awe of what she did and who she was, but she always refused that because, she wanted to be wholly dependent on God. And it's not a model that can govern every religious order. I wouldn't say they should. It's not necessarily the model that should govern every human life. But I think every Christian should look at that and say, that's really the gold standard of how one ought to act, vis-a-vis any, assets that you personally have. And I think that's why she's revered. She really enacts that, with respect to money, an attitude of total self-gift.
Yeah, it's a beautiful example. Well, we're getting some questions coming in, Gary. So Jane asks, when we give money as alms, should we be concerned about what the person uses the gift for, or should it just be a free gift? So this is a great question that people have oftentimes.
That's a great question, and there's no good answer to that question. That's the first thing I want to say. And actually, the Christian tradition has, gone back and forth on this. And actually, in the 16th and 17th centuries, when, the government begins to become active in this, this becomes, a huge problematic point. Actually, there's a huge a debate in Spain in the 17th century between a Benedictine and a Dominican. And the Dominican, really resists the reforms that are being enacted, many of them like this, to check out the credentials of the receiver. And the Dominican, who wins in the short term but loses in the long term, wants to say, well, that's not the way God distributes his grace. If we were going to go around and, try to quantify when God shows mercy to us and then to ask, did we deserve it? Did we squander it?
Yeah.
And this Dominican was appalled by that, and he said that's what almsgiving is meant to reflect, that kind of pure generosity. Now, having gone down that direction, I don't think anyone, simply wants to give money to people who are drug users or what have you. But I guess I want to say it's a complex issue. People always want a simple answer to that. And I think maybe it's important to say there is no simple answer, because either way you go is not a happy solution, right? I only want to give to people who deserve. Well, then, that's not how God's love works.
No, I love.
But, I don't want to support, behavior that's, illegal or what have you. I mean, that's understandable as well.
Yeah, I think that's where St. Thomas says prudence is how to deal with the particulars of a particular situation. And it just takes practical wisdom sometimes to know the right way to give and to whom to give. Anna in New Jersey has a fantastic question that I'm so glad she asked this, because this comes up a lot whenever I hear people talk about, I hear the subject of almsgiving. What counts as almsgiving? They give to the poor, they give to certain charities like the shelter, homeless shelter, and they give to other Catholic charities and groups. What falls under almsgiving?
That's a great question too, and I don't think easy to answer. And I think something that someone should take up with their their confessor, spiritual advisor, or what have you. I would maybe say this: in the early church as well as in the synagogue, what distinguished Christian giving from pagan giving, and pagans were also very, very generous, but they were generous in terms of funding the public baths, public theater, the Colosseum, and the church, as we know from the famous story about St. Lawrence, engaged in a kind of giving that Romans thought was completely foolish, to individuals that you certainly couldn't give you anything back, nor ostensibly wouldn't benefit the public order.
So, Gary, would you say that there's a certain privileging of the poor when it comes to almsgiving? Yeah.
And the suffering, certainly, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. But, also, I think Catholic schools and Catholic institutions that are charged with forming people to do that as well. So I think, that certainly can count as well. But again, what people think is going to be legitimate is going to differ from person to person. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. And I don't have anything in the end against giving to symphony orchestras or the public arts. But I think one should realize that when one does that, it certainly shouldn't be the sum total of your giving. And at least classically wasn't understood as the kind of virtuous giving that the church was, in favor of.
Yeah, and I think you already quoted that text from Matthew 25, verse 36 and following, where Jesus talks about clothing the naked. You to the righteous, he says, you gave me clothes when I was naked. You gave me food when I was hungry. You visited me in prison. I mean, those kind of corporal works of mercy as well are a beautiful way of doing that. Well, here's another question. Kristen asks, when you said we can suffer for another, how does that actually play out in daily life? So I think Kristen's asking about this idea from Hopkins of suffering as part of the form of almsgiving and charity.
So by suffering, I think he means, and this is actually what he says, that your daily routine would be, let's say, inconvenient. So if you were used to at 10 a.m. Going to Starbucks and getting a $5 coffee and a scone, I think that, he might, encourage you to give sufficient money that, for certainly the period of Lent, you couldn't do that, or you couldn't do something else. In other words, it's not a matter of just dropping $1 in, like the Salvation Army box at Christmas, where, it's just your loose change and you're unaffected by it. I think and the same thing would go with your time. I love to watch football on Sundays, so maybe I should go to a nursing home and visit the sick then, deprive myself of my football watching.
And that's where
serve another.
Yeah, and that's where part of the church's discipline of fasting is you give up those things so that you have more money, so the everyday person would have more money to give to alms. And so you would
Right.
kind of make those sacrifices so you could give more alms, even if they were basic and simple. Well, Michael asked a question, and this question is one that we oftentimes hear with these topics, and so I'm glad Michael asked it. Why should I give when so many churches in Rome look like palaces and have so much art and gold?
Well, I don't know. First of all, I don't. I've always heard that a lot of that, the money of the church in Rome, and I'm no expert here, but there are a lot of that is also governed or stands under Italian law. They couldn't simply sell everything they had. I don't know. I can't judge that. That's not my domain. I think the issue with respect to Manly Hopkins or the Bible or what have you, Mother Teresa, she's not worried about what's going on in Rome. She's worried about the people that are suffering right in front of her.
Yep.
If you're a person like myself, born into privilege, it doesn't really matter, at least to me. I mean, if I'm going to justify myself before God, what others do is irrelevant. The question is, what do I do? What's the state of my own, spiritual, path? And what are the needs in my immediate community and the people around me? I guess for me, those are the questions to ask. If you're worked up or bothered by what you think is an abuse of monetary wealth by the church, which certainly has happened, it's I think there's a position, or certainly an argument that can be made that you should criticize. You should do whatever to call the church to responsibility for her financial assets.
Yeah.
The church, it has corruption in it now. It has had it in the past, and will always have corruption, and counts on lay people with formed moral consciences to call it to task.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great point, Gary. And I think the more you get a chance to study the history of the church, that there is moments of corruption and yet moments of saints. And we've got saints and sinners even today. We've got the Mother Teresas. There's wonderful people out there working with the poor that we can help support right now. And there's a lot of poor people we can give directly to that we can help. And if there's corruption, we can't let that stop us from being generous, because we're also, and I think this is part of the Lenten spirituality, we also deal with our own personal corruption that we focus on during this Lenten season for our own conversion. And we ask God to be merciful. And I think I just want to recommend again for people to take and read this great book that Gary's given us on charity and the place of the poor in the biblical tradition. You can get this. I feel so convicted about this book. We've got it on our website that people can purchase. So if you go to Catholic.market, you can order Gary's book, and I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful book. It gives you the Jewish, the biblical, both Old Testament, New Testament, and some wonderful quotes from people like St. John Chrysostom and some of the early church fathers on the role of charity. It's so important. And I think, Gary, one of the things we need to come back and talk about is what happens in the 16th century to derail the role of almsgiving and charity. I think we'll do a whole episode on that, because I could tell from some of the other questions, unfortunately, we don't have time for that. People are asking that, and it deserves its own episode. So, Gary, I want to thank you for being on.
I'd really like to make a case for indulgences. I think that they're terribly treated by most people, and I think the good argument can be made for them.
Oh, fabulous. We'll do a show on indulgences. I've got someone brave enough to talk about that. So I'm glad you volunteered for that, Gary. Well, it's been an absolute delight to have you on, Gary. I'm so glad for you to make the time and share your wisdom with us, and for that. And we'll get you back and we'll talk about indulgences. And I want to let everybody know, too, that next week we're going to have another topic. It's going to be called our Lenten Halftime Show with Dr. Ben Akers. We did that last year, and it was one of the most popular shows we did. So it's hard to believe that we'll be close to halfway through Lent. So keep persevering in your sacrifices and all that you're doing, and in your prayer and in your fasting and your almsgiving. And I want to thank everybody who includes us in your almsgiving and our mission circle. That's our monthly giving society for those who give just $10 or more a month to the Augustine Institute. It really supports our mission. It helps us bring on great guests and share the good news around the world. And I don't know if everybody knows that on Formed, we have people who watch Formed in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, South America, and Africa. So it's a delight to have this international following. And I wish the Lord to bless all of you, and thanks for joining us. God bless.